What is going on, guys? Welcome to another Fitness Pain-Free show. Today's show is, should you be training to failure to maximize strength and muscle? Welcome to the Fitness Pain-Free show, where I help physical therapists learn how to get their clients out of pain and back to training in the gym. My name is Dan Pope, and I'll be your instructor. I'm a physical therapist, coach, and fellow meathead. I love training just as much as you do and want to help you get all of your patients out of pain and back to the gym where they belong. We've got an article by Grigic et al. Sorry, probably butchered that, but let's get moving. So first and foremost, thank you so much for your support. You allow me to do what I love for a living. I'm very appreciative. My name is Dan Pope. I'm a physical therapist. I'm a coach, personal trainer, and meathead. This is the Fitness Pain-Free show, where we help coaches and physical therapists like you get your patients out of pain and back to training. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that like button, comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you are listening via podcast, please rate and review. If you want to take that extra step and support me further, please subscribe to Fitness Pain-Free Insiders. It is a comprehensive educational resource and toolkit for the fitness and rehab professional. Think Netflix, but for trainers and physical therapists. It is my premium content. Very similar content to the Fitness Pain-Free show, but way more in-depth. I update this once per month. I've been doing this for the past 5+ years. There's a lot of content in there, right? 100+ webinars, ebooks, complete guides. You also have access to a private Facebook group to have all your questions answered by me. You can decide upcoming podcast topics. We can go deep into whatever topic you like. I also have a nice, easy trial period, 1 week, $1, very, very cheap. Afterwards, it's $9.99 per month, so still quite cheap for what you get, and you can cancel at any time. All you have to do is head to fitnesspainfree.com, go to the programs section, and then click on Fitness Pain-Free Insiders online library to get started. So a little introduction. Why do we care about this topic? Why do we care about training to failure versus not training to failure? Well, first and foremost, you want to figure out the best way to build muscle mass and strength, right? If I train to failure, am I going to build a little more muscle mass than if I don't train to failure, right? And the other thing that's important for me as a physical therapist, right? Because I'm not a physical therapy, is my risk of injury any different if I train to failure versus not, right? And here's the thing. This is theoretical. There's no research, as far as I know, about this topic right now. If I train to failure, will that create more injury? I'm not sure. And purely from an anecdotal standpoint, I do see this. I think folks that train to failure too frequently might be a little more at risk for injury, okay? So I will actually prescribe things like RPE and reps in reserve in order to reduce some of that intensity that people are using, the total load that people are using. But again, this is purely anecdotal, but I think it is a smart tool that you can use with your clients in the gym. And we'll kind of delve a little more into this topic and the nuances towards the end, right? So the implications of training not to failure are that we may be able to reduce risk of injury, right? So we can alter the RPE, we can alter the reps in reserve, we can do maybe higher rep sets so people aren't approaching failure as much as they would be if they're doing maybe heavier sets where they actually can't move the bar anymore, the bar stops, right? So that's what we're trying to figure out here. So in terms of building muscle, here's kind of our theoretical framework. So when I'm strength training, doing my first few repetitions, let's say on the bench press, initially mostly slow twitch muscle fibers are recruited. As those type 1 fibers start to fatigue, I start to recruit more type 2 fibers, right? And these type 2 fibers are more for strength, more for power. They also have more ability to grow, right? So we kind of want to target those as best we can. So if I go to failure, I may maximally recruit all muscle fibers a little bit better, all these motor units, right? So as I start training, type 2 fibers are starting to become activated. They get tired, they fatigue. Now the type 2 fibers have to kick in, they fatigue. If I go to failure, theoretically, I have fatigued all of those fibers, all of the motor units. This is theoretically the best way to build muscle mass and size, right? So it makes sense. If I go to failure, probably going to be a little bit better than not train at failure, right? But here's the thing. In terms of the literature we have so far, we have mixed results here. You'll actually find in some studies that going to failure has better results, right? In some studies, you'll find worse results, right? So maybe these folks are overtraining. I don't know. We'll talk about this a bit later. And then a lot of studies, it's the same results. So maybe it doesn't matter whatsoever, right? So what were the study goals? Because it sounds like there's already some research on this subject, right? Because this is a new article for the most part. Well, they wanted to have an update on the question. Since the last meta-analysis was done, 8 more studies were released, right? They wanted to incorporate all these studies into a new meta-analysis, see if the results were any different. They also wanted to see if there was a change in hypertrophy, right, for changing failure versus non-failure training. Because in the past, most of these studies were done with strength, right? They weren't actually looking at hypertrophy, and both of these things are important to us, okay? Another important caveat is that some studies did not equate volume between groups, and this is actually pretty important because we know volume is important for strength as well as muscle mass. So if you have some studies that aren't actually looking at how many sets and reps that you're doing, and they're not equating these numbers, then you're probably going to find a difference based on that, right? And the last bit is that the authors wanted to give practical recommendations. So what do coaches do? What do strength coaches, what should you prescribe to maximize strength and power, right? So let's see some of the methods of this study. What was the inclusion criteria for the study? So really they used any ages, okay? And what you'll find is the majority of folks in these studies were younger, which means that maybe this doesn't carry over to older individuals. And they were comparing resistance training to failure versus not to failure, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about the differences because, training to failure is pretty obvious. You just can't do another repetition, right? You fail. But not training to failure is not so much. You could have 2 more reps in the tank, 1 more rep in the tank, right? You could have 10 more reps in the tank. So there's a little nuance there. It's very gray. They only included studies where the protocol was at least 6 weeks long. In all of the studies, the programs were somewhere between 6 and 14 weeks. They were assessing differences in muscle mass. In 7 of the studies, they did look at this. They're using cross-sectional area of muscles for most of these studies. They're also assessing differences in strength. And they had 15 total studies that were looking at the difference in strength before and after a training cycle. And they were looking at 1 rep max, 6 rep max, and they're also looking at isometric tests, right? That's how they were judging the differences in strength before and afterwards. All these participants were healthy, which I think is important to note because in a rehab setting, most of these folks are not healthy. And I don't know if these the results of this study would carry over to my folks that hurt all the time, right? And then the frequency and how often these people are training is 2 to 3 times per week. So here's the thing. Now, whenever you have a meta-analysis, they're taking a whole bunch of studies, right? And they're trying to come to some sort of conclusion with a lot of folks. However, I think sometimes you miss a lot, right? Because every single study does things a little bit differently. So I wanted to go into one of these studies, just get an idea of the nuances between the studies, right? So this study is by Izquierda et al. I really apologize. I actually have the citation here. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching on a podcast, you can just check the YouTube if you want to read this study yourself. But I wanted to look at one of these studies specifically to give you some of these nuances. So this study here was 11 weeks long, and it was looking at Basque sports, which I didn't really know much about, but those are hand sports, and they were players in Spain, right? What I really wanted to look into was the example set and rep scheme, right? What was the failure group doing, and what was the non-failure group doing, right? So generally speaking, they used 3 sets of 6 to 8 repetitions with around 70 to 80% of a 1 rep max, okay? So in the non-failure group, basically, they were using what's traditionally known as, let's say 80% of your 1 rep max, you can do around 10 total times. So, I would say that most of these folks are probably leaving 2 reps in the tank for every set, right? And then the failure group is basically going until they can't do repetitions anymore, right? So they go to the point where either they fail completely or the bar pauses for greater than 1 second, right? And here's the thing. So the sets were dropped 3 to 4 times per session in the failure group. So basically what happens is that the failure group gets super tired and they can't maintain the same weight on the bar, and they'd have to drop. And this would happen several times throughout the course of the session, right? So if I go to absolute failure on set 1, set 2, I can't match that same set. I'm way too tired. So this is what happened in this group. So I think what ended up happening is that the non-failure group probably had some more high-quality sets than the failure group, because the failure group kept on having to drop off over and over again. So I didn't look at the rest of the studies in this meta-analysis, and I think you would really have to go in there to get a good idea of how each individual study performed their failure training, because this becomes a big problem, because if you train to non-failure, what does that mean? Are you leaving 1 rep in the tank? Are you leaving 3 reps in the tank, 4 reps in the tank? And what's optimal, right? So here's the thing. At least in this study, they had similar strength gains between groups. So if you went to failure or if you didn't go to failure, you had the same difference, right? So if you follow this kind of model, and if you're a Basque hand sport player in Spain, that's probably the result you'll get, right? Is this generalizable to other populations? Who knows? Probably. I'm not really sure. At the end of the day, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that there's a difference between all of the studies in this meta-analysis, and that's a bit of a problem. And we'll talk about the implications a little bit later. But going back to the main study, what were the results of this meta-analysis? So generally, in terms of strength, there was no significant difference between the training conditions. So if you trained to failure versus didn't train to failure, there's no difference generally in strength, right? So studies that did not equate training volume, which we know this is really important, had a moderate significant effect favoring the non-failure training group, right? So that means that folks that didn't go to failure actually did a little bit better, right? But then again, when you equate the training volume, there's no significant difference. And like I said in that prior study, if you have to keep on dropping down the weight on the bar or drop the repetitions because you're so tired, then maybe that's the reason why you don't have a great gain in strength as compared to the non-failure training group. Is just because you don't have that same amount of volume. And once they control for that volume, then there's no difference between the groups, right? And here's what's kind of cool. In this study, they were looking at training status, they were looking at body region, they were looking at exercise selection and study design. Training status just means, are you a trained individual or are you absolutely new to strength training? And there's actually no difference. So one of the thoughts is that if you've been training for years and years and years, maybe you have to train a little bit more towards failure, right, to see a difference because you've been training for so long, whereas someone that's new, that doesn't have a lot of exposure to weight training, anything kind of works. Well, it looks like there was really no difference between those two groups, which I think is really important because the majority of people that I work with have been training for years, right? And they're trying to continue getting better as opposed to being brand new, which, do anything, they'll probably start building some muscle mass. So how about in terms of muscle mass? And, spoiler alert, we already know this, but there's no significant difference between the training conditions, okay? So basically, if you train to failure or if you don't train to failure, you're going to have the same improvement in muscle mass. In resistance-trained individuals, there was a a significant effect for training to failure on muscle hypertrophy. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Let's say that you've been training for a long period of time. You might have to go towards failure on some of your sets, a little more so than someone who's more of a novice to improve muscle mass. Okay, we didn't show this with strength, but we did find this with hypertrophy. And then again, training volume, body region, or study design had no difference on outcome. Okay, so in terms of muscle mass, if you were experienced, maybe going to failure is a bit better, but otherwise it's going to be the same between non-failure and failure. So what conclusions did the authors jump to? What was in the discussion section? So basically, training to muscular failure may produce similar increases in muscular strength and muscle size as non-failure training. Okay, kind of cool. And this was found to be consistent among subgroups, right? So basically, if you're trained versus not trained, if you are training your legs versus training your upper body, okay, the impact of training to failure is not likely to be moderated by these variables, okay? So kind of cool. What outliers did we find? Because we talked about this a little before. So when volume is not equated, muscular strength gains favored training that did not include muscular failure, right? And we talked about this before. So if I am training to failure, then maybe I have to drop my volume because I can't finish my sets because I'm too tired, right? So maybe if I have more volume, I get more strength, right? And then if I go to failure less often, I feel more fresh throughout the course of my session. I can fit in more volume, and maybe that equates to more strength. Who knows? And then training to failure might be a benefit in terms of muscle hypertrophy for resistance-trained individuals. So maybe there is something towards the idea of training to failure. Maybe you are maximally recruiting all motor units. Maybe you're stimulating that muscle a little bit better, and over the course of time, you'll get a little bit better change in muscle hypertrophy, at least for someone who's been training for years, right? And in terms of muscle fiber recruitment, here's an interesting thought that the authors were talking about. So most of these studies were using loads 60 to 90% of a 1 rep max. Most of these loads relatively high. And what we know about type 2 muscle fibers, they tend to be recruited with heavier loads, right, and faster movements. So if we use heavier loads from the get-go of a set, we're probably getting those type 2 fibers working from the start, right? And in some research, and this was a study where Brad Schoenfeld was an author, I don't think he was the main author, but they found that in order to maximally stimulate hypertrophy, and if you used higher reps, so around 19 repetitions or so, you had to go to failure. Whereas if you use anything that was below around 12 reps, you didn't have to go to failure. There wasn't a change, right? So maybe the type 2 fibers are recruited at the start for heavier loads, but in order to get those type 2 fibers with lighter loads, you kind of have to train to failure, right? That's a thought, but who knows? That's just a theory. Okay? What are some limitations for this study, or maybe some areas for future research? Well, first and foremost, it was all in young, healthy folks, right? What the heck happens when you have older individuals, maybe with more orthopedic injuries, right? I work as a physical therapist. I'm seeing older folks. I'm seeing younger folks as well, but I'm seeing folks in pain, right? Is this the same for folks that are in pain? And I think this is a big topic in the paper, but I think the big thing that pops out, right, the elephant in the room here is that what are they using in terms of RPE? What are they using in terms of reps of reserve, right? And what's the optimal dosage? Do we need to be at an RPE 8 or 9 out of 10 to get the optimal effect? Or will an RPE of like 6 or 7 work just as well? I don't think we really know that, but my gut tells me you probably have to get a little closer to muscular failure over the course of time. I think if we're progressively loading the body, that naturally happens. Maybe towards the beginning of a training cycle, you're starting with a lower RPE, and towards the end of that training cycle, you're getting close to failure. And that's just natural with progressive overload. So over the course of time, maybe we're naturally getting that well. But I don't really know if that's the case. Maybe we don't have to push as hard as we think we do in order to make progress over the course of time. That's just my bias, Over the course of time, we'll get some more research and maybe we'll figure that out. So what were the clinical takeaways? What kind of popped into my mind? And this kind of goes back to our introduction. The reason why I think this is probably a nice paper for physical therapists, especially. So this is theoretical. If I don't have to train a failure all the time, right? If I can take those folks that I believe are hurting themselves because they're going to failure too frequently and just say, hey, the research is pretty clear. You don't have to train a failure all the time to maximize your muscle mass and your strength, okay? I think you're pushing your head, bumping against the wall all the time by trying to push too hard in the gym. I may be able to prescribe more RPEs. I may be able to prescribe more RIRs in order to improve that person's performance without hurting them over the course of time. And just keep in mind, this is theoretical. We don't have the research yet to prove this or disprove this, really. But that's the kind of thought that's going on in my head. I've already been doing this, I feel, with success over the course of time. So what might this look like, right? Let's say that I have an individual that started a new training cycle and he's trying to build their bench press, right? He's building his bench press up. Let's say that we're doing four sets of 5 bench press, and we're doing this once a week for 4 weeks, right? Week 1 and 2, let's say we do 4 sets of 5 and RPE of about a 7 or 8 out of 10, right? And then weeks 3 and 4, we're doing the same thing, 4 sets of 5, but the RPE changes. Now we're doing RPE somewhere between 9 and 10. And what this allows is for progressive overload. So over the course of time, those first 2 weeks, we're actually not pushing that hard. You have a couple extra reps in the tank, and then towards the end of the month, we don't have that many reps in the tank. So maybe it's 0 to 1 reps in the tank for the last week or two, right? At least in my mind, those first, 2 to 3 weeks, we're not stressing the system as much. We're not killing your body. You're not putting that same amount of stress on your joints in the bench press. And then that last week of the month, we're really pushing it to see those new strength gains. Hopefully you hit something close to a PR and you're making progress over the course of time. But we're not going crazy every single week and going to failure, which I do think can increase your risk of injury. Okay, again, an anecdote, but I see it all the time, right? So I think the other really important place where we can learn from this study is in the rehab setting, right? So when someone has pain, let's say your shoulder hurts when you bench press, oftentimes we can't tolerate higher RPEs, right? When the loads get heavier and heavier and heavier, we generally can't tolerate the same amount. And what happens is that folks just can't continue pushing in the gym, right? It gets too painful. So can we reduce the RPE? Can we reduce that RIR, continue getting a training effect and not irritating that injured area further? Let's say the shoulder is hurting, right? And when I get to an RPE of 8 or 9 out of 10, when I'm doing my sets of, let's say, 6, right? It gets to be to the point where my pain is so high that night, the next day, I feel terrible, right? But if I can keep that RPE to around let's say a 6 or a 7 out of 10, get through that set, feel pretty good during the set, pretty good afterward, next day I feel pretty good. And I think that's a better long-term strategy for getting out of pain, certainly for the long term. But the other piece is that maybe I will actually continue along that same pathway in terms of performance too, right? Which would be phenomenal. If I can drop the load a little bit and I can rehab my shoulder, right, and continue getting stronger over the course of time, that's a win-win, okay? So maybe that's actually a very viable option, not only for rehab, but also for continuing to improve strength, right? And here's the other place where I love RPEs and reps in reserve is going to be for, let's say, a post-op patient, okay? And the same thing goes for any sort of injury, because generally after an injury, you have to ramp down the intensity and slowly ramp up over the course of time. This is just incredibly apparent after you've had a surgery, because people go from, let's say, doing a lot to doing absolutely nothing after a surgery, and then you slowly ramp up over the course of time to be as safe as possible. So let's say I have a post-op rotator cuff repair, and I want to start reintroducing barbell bench press around month 5. And this is fairly typical. I want to see that someone has decent symmetry in terms of strength with dumbbells before we move over to barbells. But let's say it's month 5. This wasn't a huge cuff tear, so it's not a massive cuff tear or anything like that. Let's say it's full thickness. Around month 5, I think it's reasonable to introduce some barbell bench press as long as strength and pain allows for that, right? Let's say first time they're bench pressing, week 1 and 2, I want you around a 6 RPE. So RPEs are phenomenal because these folks haven't been lifting, for months, right? And maybe even more than that, because oftentimes they can't lift heavy for months prior to surgery just because they've had this injury going on, right? So they have no idea what their max is. If I tell them to do 60% of their 1 rep max, that might be way too much simply because they're so deconditioned. So I use RPEs and RIRs very frequently for these folks. And we can dose the amount of stress by starting with a lower RPE, right, or higher RIR. So let's say weeks 1 and 2, I'm doing a 6 out of 10 RPE. Weeks 3 and 4, I'm doing closer to a 7 to an 8 out of 10 RPE. And let's say at month 6, so the following month, we start ramping that intensity even more. So week 1 and 2, maybe that's 4 sets of 5 and RPE 7 to 8 out of 10. And then weeks 3 through 4, that's 4 sets of 5 and RPE 9 to 10. So we're getting close to maximal loads at the end of month 6, which I think is reasonable for most individuals post-op cuff repair, even though this isn't even, a lecture on the rotator cuff. But you can see how that works out pretty well. We can use the RPEs and the RIRs in order to slowly increase the stress on the area over the course of time. And at least in my mind, I think we're maybe reducing that risk of injury because we're not throwing too much intensity, too much load at that individual all at once, right? So I think that's a great takeaway you guys can implement right away with your rehab, okay? So what else? I think from a practicality standpoint, and I don't know if you ever tried this in the gym, so if you've been training for a long period of time, right, you'll kind of know that you can't take all your sets to failure. That's just a little bit unreasonable, right, especially for lower body exercises. If you're doing, let's say, 4 sets of 10 deadlifts and you're trying to take every single set to failure, that's going to absolutely wreck your body, right? Every once in a while, during my first set, I'll go a little too heavy, and the rest of the entire session is affected. I often feel like I have to just leave the gym after the first exercise because it was just too intense, right? So I think it's important that we keep this in mind. We don't want to go to failure all the time because, A, you don't have to optimize strength and hypertrophy, but B, because it's probably going to absolutely tank your body. And over the course of time, you're not going to be able to get high quality sets in during your accessory movements because you've just gone way too hard on those main lifts, right? Sounds god awful to be doing your entire training program to failure on everything, right? And I think the other important takeaway here is that it's kind of dealer's choice. if you're a strength coach and you're trying to get someone stronger and you're trying to build muscle mass, you can go to failure or not, right? And you can kind of do anything in between. It really seems like you have the flexibility to choose what's best for the person in front of you. So studies like this, if nothing else, just kind of show you that there's more than one way to skin a cat. I hate and love that saying because I love cats, but I hate the the idea of it. But it's such a good, I don't know, analogy or like a descriptor, right? So you can get someone better in a variety of ways. You can get them stronger. You can build muscle mass in a variety of ways. Okay, so dealer's choice. So that is it, guys. Thank you so much for listening to this. I really appreciate your support. If you are watching this on YouTube, please give me a thumbs up, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, and please subscribe to the channel, right? If you're listening to this on podcast, please leave me a positive rating and review. If you want to support me that one step above, one step further, head over to fitnesspainfree.com, click on the programs link, click on Fitness Pain Free Insiders, and sign up for the program. It's $1 for a week trial. It's only $9.99 afterwards, super cheap. In the future, you can ask any topic you'd like. I'll cover it on a future episode of the Fitness Pain Free Show, and you get more great learning. There's a lot of great content in there, okay? Thank you guys very much, and I'll see you on the next one.